The driver tells him to move to the back of the bus, and the young army officer does not move. It is the summer of 1944, at a military base in Texas, and a black second lieutenant in the uniform of the United States Army has taken a seat on a bus and been ordered by the civilian driver to get up and go to the back where black passengers belong. He knows something the driver may not, which is that the Army has officially forbidden this exact segregation on its buses. He knows he is within his rights. And he knows, too, exactly what it will cost a black officer in the Deep South in 1944 to defy a white man over a seat. He weighs all of it in an instant, and he stays where he is. That single refusal is about to put him in front of a court-martial that could destroy his life, and it is about to reveal the character of a man the whole world will one day know. To understand the danger he was in, you have to understand the army he served. It was rigidly segregated, top to bottom, black soldiers kept in separate units, given the worst assignments, commanded largely by white officers, and subjected daily to the humiliations of the Jim Crow country their bases sat in. A black officer occupied an especially precarious place, expected to lead yet constantly reminded he was considered less. And any black man who pushed back against a white civilian, even one clearly in the wrong, risked everything. The safe thing, the expected thing, was to swallow it and move to the back. This lieutenant would not. When the bus reached the end of the line, the driver summoned the military police, and the situation escalated fast. The lieutenant, questioned and provoked, stood on his rights and his dignity, and did not back down, and the army, which could not actually charge him for the bus, since its own rules had desegregated that bus, reached for other charges instead. He was accused of insubordination, of disrespect toward officers during the confrontation, a stack of military charges assembled to punish a man for refusing to be humiliated. He was placed under arrest and ordered to stand a general court-martial, the most serious kind, the kind that can end in a prison sentence and a ruined life. The lieutenant's name was Jack Roosevelt Robinson, and the world that Jackie Robinson, the man who 3 years later would break the color barrier in Major League Baseball and become one of the most important Americans of the century. But before one of the most important American, but before the baseballs and a court, martial, and it is all documented, Dame, in the Army's own trial record, it happened. The new chapters of his life, and it is one of the most revealing stuff, and one almost no one knows. Before we go further, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now, back to Lieutenant Robinson and to how a college sports star ended up on trial in a Texas Army camp. Jackie Robinson was already, before the war, an extraordinary athlete, a four-sport star at the University of California in Los Angeles, one of the finest all-around athletes in the country. Drafted into the Army in 1942, he ran straight into its color line. He and other qualified black soldiers were at first kept out of officer candidate school, until pressure, including help from the heavyweight champion Joe Louis, then also in the Army, helped force the doors open. Robinson earned his commission and his lieutenant's bars, and was assigned to a black tank battalion, and he spent his service doing what he would do his whole life, which was refusing, quietly and stubbornly, to accept the indignities the system kept handing him. He had already, more than once, pushed back against the discrimination around him, insisting on fair treatment for himself and his men, making himself known as an officer who would not simply look away. So when the moment came on that bus, it was not an impulse. It was entirely told he was less. It was the same man who had spent his whole spodel life declining to be told he was hund. He missed, and giving the same answer moved him to the back, the same answer he always gave. The path to those lieutenants' bars had itself been a fight. When Robinson and other qualified black soldiers applied for officer candidate school, they found the door quietly shut, held closed by the same segregation that governed everything else. It took sustained pressure to force it open, and among those who applied that pressure was one of the most famous men in America, the heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Louis, who was serving in the Army at the same time and used his fame to push for the admission of black officer candidates. The door opened. Robinson earned his commission. But he had already learned, before he ever pinned on his bars, that in this army nothing fair would come to him unless someone was willing to fight for it. The court-martial convened in August 1944, and the army threw its weight at him. But Robinson had something the system had not counted on. He had the facts on his side, because the desegregation of the buses was real and documented. He had his own composure and intelligence, which came through clearly to the officers judging him. and he had able counsel who dismantled the inflated charges, exposing them for what they were, an attempt to punish a black officer for the offense of standing up for himself. Robinson testified with dignity and clarity, and the case against him fell apart under its own weight. He was acquitted. The court-martial found him not guilty on every count, a genuine and meaningful victory, a black lieutenant in 1944 Texas taking on the machinery of a segregated army and winning. It was not a small thing, and it was not a safe thing, and it ended the way justice is supposed to end. And so, rarely did for men like him in that time and place. But the victory came at a price, as such victories usually do. It is worth pausing on how unlikely that acquittal was. A black lieutenant in Texas in 1944, charged by his own army, standing before a panel of officers in a segregated military inside a segregated state, had every reason to expect the system to close ranks against him. That it did not, that the charges were seen for the flimsy things they were and thrown out, was a genuine act of justice. And it was possible only because Robinson had been so plainly, provably in the right, and had carried himself with such control that the case against him simply could not stand. He had met the army on its own ground, on its own terms, and walked out cleared. The ordeal had consumed months, and it had consequences. While Robinson's Battalion, the 761st, shipped out to Europe without him. That unit, the Black Panthers, went on to fight with tremendous distinction under General Patton, one of the standout armored battalions of war, military government battalions of the war. Robinson, cleared but sidelined, never made it overseas, never saw the combat he had trained for. Not long after his acquittal, he was honorably discharged from the army. His military career quietly contred him, for it would have been easy then to read his war as a disappointment, a promising officer ground down and pushed out by a system determined not to let him rise. But that is not what it was. What that bus and that courtroom revealed was the exact thing that would make him one of the most important figures in American history, a man who would not accept injustice quietly, who would stand on his rights, given against of overwhelming pressure and pay whatever it cost. The army had, without meaning to, given the country a preview of Jackie Robinson. The unit that shipped to Europe without him made history of its own. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, fought through some of the hardest campaigns of the war, spent more days in sustained combat than almost any armored unit, and earned a reputation for courage that, decades later, brought them a Presidential Unit citation. They proved in blood everything the segregated army had refused to believe about black soldiers. Robinson was not with them, held back by a court-martial over a bus seat, while the men he had trained beside fought their way across Europe. It was one more cost of the injustice, and one more thing that injustice could not in the end stop. 3 years later, in 1947, Jackie Robinson walked onto a field for the Brooklyn Dodgers and became the first black player in modern Major League Baseball, breaking a color barrier that had stood for generations. He endured, in front of the whole country, a torrent of abuse that would have broken most people, and he answered it with a controlled, unbreakable dignity that changed the game and helped change the nation. The courage America watched on the baseball diamond was not new. It had been forged years earlier, in places no one was watching. Robinson himself understood what that year had taught him. He had gone into the army to serve his country and had found himself fighting 2 wars at once, one against the enemy overseas that he never got the chance to face, and one against the prejudice of the very country whose uniform he wore. The second war he would fight for the rest of his life, and never stop. The bus, the arrest, the courtroom in Texas were an early battle in it, and he won that one, and it hardened him for all the battles still to come. It had been forged, in part, on a bus in Texas, where a young lieutenant was told to move to the back and refused, 11 years before Rosa Parks would make the same refusal famous. Jackie Robinson faced a court-martial for that seat and beat it, and then he went and did something even larger, and the thread running through all of it was a single, simple, unshakable thing. He would not accept being treated as less than he was. He would not move to the back, not on that bus, not in that courtroom, not on that field, not ever. The world remembers the ball player. It should remember the lieutenant too, because they were the same brave man, and the second one made the first one possible.